welcome to View from the Commentary Box here at Scottish Gas Murrayfield, and to be honest, it wasn't a very pleasant view at half-time. Scotland running out winners against France in the end by 25 points to 21, so 2 wins out of 2 in the summer series, but they were 21-3 down at half-time. And joining me in the commentary box is Talksport's commentator Stuart McFarlane. Stuart, it was a real roller coaster.
It was. There was quite a sea change at half-time when you consider that France had scored 3 tries in the first 40 minutes, looked quite comfortable. They capped 3 new players from the start. They had a lot of fluency. They scored 2 in particular. The first 2 tries were wonderful tries, really easy on the eye. They looked every bit a country that had an abundance of talent that was going to go into a home World Cup in great form. And Scotland had 3 points on the board courtesy of their captain Finn Russell, and a lot of questions to ask themselves at half time and try and find the answers to those questions. But I think we've seen it before under Gregor Townsend. You know, at half time there can be quite a sea change, and it was almost an unrecognisable performance in the second period.
A lot of people were in the press in particular were saying that, well, this is a second string France team and there wouldn't be too much problem getting past them. Do you think there was a bit of that getting into the mindset of the players early on, sort of underestimating the team?
The Scottish players underestimating the French? I don't necessarily think so. I think France played very well in the first 40 minutes. I think it did take Scotland quite a bit of time to find their groove. Only 2 of the Scotland players on show from the start had played last weekend, so there was a bit of rustiness in the Scotland side themselves in terms of just trying to blow any cobwebs away and really get into the mindset of this being a competitive, full-blooded international game. The French side, I mean, they've been so smooth and cohesive for so long. I think it was 1 defeat in 18 games coming into it. And I mean, there's no question about the quality on the attack. What Scotland lacked in the first 40 minutes for long periods was any ball. And I think that was the first thing they had to address. And I think they would go into the game knowing that, yes, it wouldn't necessarily be Fabien Galtier's first 15, but they were up against 15 very good players right from the start. And I mean, if anybody was in any doubts about that, after about 20-25 minutes, that point was surely rubber stamped by those first 2 tries they scored.
We remember, of course, days of old, Andy Robinson smashing into the table in the press box, in the commentary box, and we don't see that from Gregor Townsend. In fact, we were having a look at the pictures coming through on our monitors at half-time. Seemed a very, very calm figure.
I think outwardly, you know, he conveys that, but I think inwardly, you know, there's an awful lot going on in his mind in terms, and I think individual mistakes will fuel frustration. There's no question about that. I think that's the same with literally any coach, regardless of your outward demeanour. But I think he clearly studied the French team in the first 40 minutes, looked at how strong they were, but right from the kick-off, the start of the second half, Jack Dempsey wins clean ball from the restart and makes some ground, and Scotland are able to get out of their own 22 almost in one fluent movement and get them on the front foot. And then Blair Kinghorn, almost in the first attack he was involved in the second half, suddenly was bypassing players, getting Darcy Graham more involved. I mean, all through the game, in fairness to him, Van der Merwe was coming off his wing and looking for work, and that's maybe been a criticism of him in the past. He doesn't do that enough. But when Scotland suddenly found ways to win ball, very often they made the most of it.
And it was relentless, wasn't it?
It was, and it had to be. It has to be. If we're talking about Scotland, you know, sitting in the single figures in the world rankings, but if you want to continue to climb the ladder and really test the islands, the French side, the South Africans, New Zealands of this world just now, even still in their present form, England, you have to have a relentless game, physical and mental, because that's the only way now that you can find a way to win. But there was still hiccups along the way. There were still concerns. There was the red card, I'm sure you'll come to. There was the discipline factor. there was, first half in particular, before Cameron Vaughey scored the try, I think they conceded 4 penalties in quick succession within 90 seconds. So it's aspects of that game, while the second half in isolation you will look at and say was, a much improved performance and was really, clinical play from the Scots. There's still other areas that a stronger French team or a stronger Irish team wouldn't allow Scotland away back into the game, especially with 14 men.
A couple of stats that kind of stood out for me. In the first half, I think half an hour had gone, and it showed that Scotland had only breached the 22 for France for 19 seconds, which was extraordinary. And then even more extraordinary, after about half an hour, even with the red card, which, as I say, we will come to shortly, 93% possession. I haven't seen that stat, I don't think, ever.
Yeah, I mean, that illustrates the sea change that we mentioned at the very beginning, and it illustrates that when Scotland had possession of the ball, they were able to retain it and do a lot of meaningful things with it. We'll come, I'm sure, at some point to Finn Russell's game. I think it was a productive game. I think it was a pretty sound game as a captain. I think he made a lot of good decisions. He was in a difficult position going in with a 21 points to 3 deficit at half time. I think it wasn't a throw caution to the wind approach that they would take in the second half, or was it a damage limitation exercise? But they simply found a way, and it would be interesting to know what he had shared with everybody in the dressing room at half time, because he has been known in the past to make some observations that have led to significant turnarounds.
And I think also at half time some of the players themselves will be thinking, look, do I really want to be on the aeroplane here?
Well, I think as an aeroplane heads over, I don't think there'll be any Scottish players necessarily on that one heading to Paris, but you have to sort of look at these matches. They're not warm-ups, they're not friendlies. You could argue, I suppose, they're a warm-up game in a sense. They are a scene setter for the World Cup, but you've got to go in with that World Cup mindset, because there's a lot of players will know that their place is on the line, and they're either going to fall on one side of the line or the other, depending on how effective they are. So they need to go out there, and again, individually and collectively, as we mentioned last week, they've got to produce their A game. And especially when a team like this French side are asking you questions and you don't appear to have the answers in the first 40 minutes. So that will concern Gregor. You've got to put that 80-minute game together when you're playing in the latter stages of a tournament, and Scotland have a lot to do in order to get to the latter stages because of this incredibly difficult group they find themselves in.
Still lots to talk about, but let's go on the injury situation. And the one casualty that we were aware of was obviously Ben White, who had to hobble off in the end. They gave him about 5-10 minutes to try and recover from that knock. Didn't work, and he's now got an ice pack on his ankle. So alarm bells there. Ali Price, obviously, and George Horne, the other two sort of high profile number 9s there. What's going to happen there, do you think?
I think George Horne will be a very satisfied man this evening given his performance. I think Ben White will be a very anxious man this evening given what has happened to him, and it's probably the worst thing to see at this stage in a preparation for a major tournament that comes around every 4 years. A player going off and there's a big question mark over the severity of an injury, when you look at it and you think it's a ligament, because it was a collision with the French right winger. It seemed to be an upper body collision, and it wasn't until we watched replays that we actually discovered that his sort of falling to the ground, he had twisted the ankle. So we don't know, that we're speculating, and we shouldn't do that over the damage to the ankle or the foot, but it's a sorry sight. But again, it provides an open door for that somebody like Ali Price, who will start next week. I would imagine will very much be in the 23 next week in Saint Etienne, and again it's his opportunity to stand up and remind Gregor what he can do.
Okay, let's move on to the red card then. The first time we've actually witnessed the bunker, and what happened was Andy Ferguson went in with his head. It was a clear cut. He went off with a yellow, and whilst that was all happening, instead of playing out over the big screens in front of the public, they now do it privately, so they've got 8 or 9 minutes to sort it out, come to a decision, and there was no real decision to come to be honest. It was a red card, and the consequences of that are pretty enormous.
Well, yes, it'll be interesting just to gauge his own. I don't necessarily know if Xander will come out and talk about it. He'll certainly not want to talk about it this evening, but it places himself in a sort of more precarious position as we go forward over the next couple of weeks. Again, it opens up an opportunity for Gregor to take somebody like Xander out of the front row for the St Etienne game. I don't necessarily think he would have featured in the Georgia game in any capacity. He may have done, but yeah, we'll just wait and see what the upshot is. But again, it was a sort of head-on-head collision. The referee had said no mitigation, hence why I think he went with the yellow, and the orange card appeared for the call that it was going to the bunker as a referral. And yeah, I mean, the most disappointed Scot of the evening, the award goes to Xander, along probably shared in fact with Ben for very different reasons.
Finn Russell then, captain for the first time. We've seen this in the past. Great players suddenly get the captaincy, big responsibility, it affects their game. Didn't seem to affect Finn.
No, I think he's got the headspace for it. I think he's got the headspace to go out and be the mercurial player, and has the headspace to go out and be the captain. And I think a lot of that is in his body language. You and I watched him, were almost mildly amused by him going onto the pitch, not necessarily any showmanship, going through a few penalty goals or conversions, and in between times he had his mobile phone in the park and he was messaging or whatever he was doing, and the crowd behind the south posts were applauding and cheering every kick that went over. I think I simply put it this way, I think he has the headspace to be able to captain when asked to do so, to make decisions when asked to do so. I think where he sometimes gets frustrated is not every player is necessarily always on his level, and I think that's an illustration of where his level is against where some of the other players are. But I would say it was maybe an unspectacular performance from him. Put in a very solid display, some good grubber kicks and some inventive play, but I think, you know, it wasn't one that was either an unmitigated disaster or a glorious success.
Mentioned a couple of other players. Darcy Graham going over for yet another try. He's up to number 19 now, and surely it won't be too long before he suddenly becomes the biggest try scorer in Scottish rugby history. So another solid performance from him, always exciting the crowd when he's on the ball. Dave Cherry though, Blair Kinghorn, another two to mention.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Dave Cherry, one of the players to come off the bench and seemed to be all round very effective with his throwing, with his carrying, scoring a try. He's the type of player that may feature in some capacity against South Africa. You know, he may be the hooker on the bench or something like that, but you know, there's maybe not the same mistakes in Dave Cherry's game, and just a good solid all-round performance. Blair Kinghorn was player of the match, outstanding second half. Again, it's almost as if, you know, he was off the leash, he was in the zone, he had the ball, and he was mightily unlucky not to score a try. He was, you know, they had a good long look at it, and it was actually, bless him, it was Darcy Graham who, some way earlier on in the move, knocked the ball forward, just trying to pick it up off his left ankle. Otherwise, Blair would have scored an excellent try, and at that moment he was the most disappointed person, I think, in the stadium. Darcy, to give him a mention, you know, he's always mentioned in dispatches. We talk about his physical stature and the fact that he can down some very, very big players. I always go back to an aspect of his game that I think has served him so well, is that ability from a standing start to accelerate over the first 10-20 metres so quickly, open up some space, and you know, there was some pace on those French wings today, but Darcy had every bit of quality to match what was on show elsewhere. And As I say, Van der Merwe was more involved because we would see him in the centre of the field far more than loitering on the wings all the time. So he'll be mindful of Darcy's 19 tries now, because he'll be wanting to try and keep toe-to-toe with him. But if Darcy does, and we expect that he will either be the front runner or one of them to break that 27 try mark that's now held by Stuart Hogg, I think he'll be a very, very popular leader and leading try scorer.
And I think we're looking at 30s and maybe even 40s with him.
I think so. I mean, it's been an awful long time coming when you compare to some of the other nations, but we're getting now to Six Nations Championships where we're no longer thinking in the low to mid single figures of winning games, 2-3 games just by kicking and getting the odd try here and there. I think the bonus point system is attractive for a lot of the players, but I think Gregor's game and the centre partnership that we've got out on show. Tuipulotu was a bit quieter today, so was Hugh Jones at times, but I mean they've got the creative spark that when the ball is spread wide, they know that they've got finishers there, and finishers that are not blowing hot and cold. That they come into an international and you feel, and I mean Darcy's been around long enough to earn 35 caps now, so it's 19 and 35, so it's a good ratio for him to have. And Van der Merwe's ratio is pretty respectable as well. And it's all about continuing that. And you hope that one day that magic mark of having a player reaching 30 in the professional era can be met.
Well, it's St Etienne next week for France, 8 o'clock kick-off, so an evening kick-off there. Then there's a bit of a gap, and then Georgia come to Scottish Gas Murrayfield. A lot of people probably, fair point. What's the point of this game for Gregor?
Well, again, it bridges a gap between the St Etienne match and the game in South Africa, because a lot of people now, a lot of those maybe behind the scenes are thinking, well, the World Cup campaign has started. It started already. It started against the Italians. Where it really counts is obviously against South Africa when we go into the pool stages. But this is a hugely important selection process that, as you mentioned earlier before we started the piece, the decisions will be made, broadly speaking anyway, about 10 days before the Georgia game. But there's still going to be players that are going to be there or thereabouts, could be call-ups at the last minute if there are any injuries or if there are any mishaps along the way. So there is that, and I think again there's that first half to put right. I mean, the Georgian team will be a very different proposition in terms of the power and the forwards, and how they want to go piling through a forest of trees and try and demolish them because of their physical strength and that. But there's still a lot to put right. That the second 40 minutes was much more promising, made even more so by the fact that we're able to produce that with 14 men for large part. But there's still that first 40 minutes to get out the system. And whether it's a mix and match of last week and this week's team in that Georgian side, I don't know. But Gregor will not entirely be satisfied. Would he have wanted 4 tests at the very beginning? Possibly not. But he might have preferred one around about this stage in the month.
Well, they certainly want to go into the World Cup with a win under their belt, which will be a psychological advantage for them. It all, of course, gets cut down, the squad, to 33. That's on the 16th of August. It's all happening at South Queensferry, in fact, at Scots. And that's where the announcement will be made. It's going to be quite an occasion, of course, for Scottish fans. Who would you put in your 33? That ended Scotland 25, France 21.